Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move to the closing oration of the conference now. So we opened with John Anderson, and I think this is going to be such a full circle for us now. John started with a diagnosis, really, of the problems that we're facing, and throughout the day we've critiqued many of those problems and thought of solutions for them, particularly technical ones in regards to the Constitution, and as Barclay's just very eruditely covered some problems facing young people and how best we can go about fixing those. We're now going to move to the final remarks of the day sessions by Sydney Barrister Graham Connolly. Gray was called to the bar, I think it was in 2008, yes, and he practices in a number of areas of law, including public law, administrative law, and also various litigations as well. So Gray's going to take us full circle and talk about really a synthesis of the conference, but also the Australia's future. So Gray, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much.
Yeah, do you want me to? I need some water.
Yes, I would. How's that? Can everyone hear me? No.
Just try.
How's that? Better? I'm very happy to use my loudest of loud voices if that helps.
Maybe handheld.
Okay. We'll just go from there. John Anderson started the conference this morning. It may be a confessional difference. John's Protestant. He's happy walking around with the microphone. Being Catholic, we like pulpits, we like order, we like function. So we'll keep that formal. But thank you very much. I had the opportunity to speak last year, and it's great to be here. I think I mentioned before that my late mother was a member of the Monarchist League, and I like to think that both my late parents would be looking down, rather intrigued about what I'm about to say. I think it's very important for us to discuss, particularly as we close out the conference. And before I close out the conference, a very, very big thank you to Alexander, without whom none of this, I think, will get done. So thank you, Alex. As I said, I think it's very important as we look forward to also look at where we have been and where we are. For those of us who, thank you very much, for those of us who remember the late 90s and the Republican referendum, indeed the 1990s, when I was at school and then university, very much the Republic was something that was in vogue. And you'll remember the Prime Minister at the time described anyone who didn't agree with him as and I think I'm quoting him correctly here, pre-Copernican antediluvian obscurantist. Nonetheless, surprisingly, that sales pitch did not go down well and did not win. Republics themselves are very interesting. They are also very volatile. The classical republics that we look back on, like Rome, Venice, Genoa, San Marino, they were stable for very long periods of time, but also they managed to blend both the democratic aspects with the aristocratic. And again, I take issue with something in a polite way that John Anderson said this morning about Rome. Rome actually is very much the basis of much of our civilization. So again, insofar as the crown has deep roots, so does the history of Western civilization from which our crowns comes, very much in the history of Rome. Indeed, the Roman occupation of Britain. Indeed, if you think back far enough, the Roman occupation of Britain that on the evacuation leads to the rise of King Arthur. So, you should never ever try to sever yourselves from your roots. And as I warned last year when discussing republics, it's very important to note what happens when monarchies become republics. Two very obvious examples in our sort of broader history of when Russia lost the Romanovs, Germany lost the Hohenzollerns, and both tried to have a republic. Both republics were very short-lived. The Kerensky Republic lasted months, the Weimar Republic lasted years, but both ended in tyranny. A tyranny I think that would have been largely unimaginable to people when they set out on that push for a republic only years before. In the case of the Kerensky Republic, only months before. The French and the Americans, they had their revolutions and civil wars. They were concerned with what they called the rights of men, but they found out that other men believed that they had rights as well. And those who thought they were asserting the rights of men turned out they were oppressing on the rights of other men. The Americans could have even gone down further down. The Americans could even have gone further down that French path, but for the healing genius of a George Washington and an Alexander Hamilton. But that is always a danger with republics. You are setting in motion a form of government that has within it a very, very good possibility of falling apart. The lesson learned, I would say, by the French was that if you topple a king, the only battle that will come after it is who gets to be king instead. I say that wearing a Napoleon tie that I was given for my birthday. Napoleon was the one who said that he found the crown of France in a gutter. He picked it up with the tip of his sword, he cleaned it and placed it upon his own head. Napoleon sort of sent the message that when the Republic falls apart, you want to have an army behind you. Somehow you go from the idea of this all about being about the people and it ending in the people behind you with lots and lots of guns and cannons. The other big problem in France, obviously, is the king was toppled and a massive stature gap was left. You can't just remove the king and expect that everyone is going to accept their place in a egalitarian mob where no one rules. Someone is always going to rule. In France, you ended up having a stature gap that is only filled periodically by people of the stature of a de Gaulle. Certainly Mr. Macron, who battles in his polls with single digits, certainly he is not the one filling that. So the question that obviously turns to us here in Australia is, what of our crown? What of our monarchy? I'm often asked why it is that many young people today seem more conservative and more open to the value of the crown and to the Constitution, certainly as compared to 1999. I think we saw some of that in the previous excellent segment. I'm not a pollster or a social analyst. I have actually, though, spent time at the ABC when I used to go on The Drum and other programs, which, again, in Catholic terms, is a form of penance. But the ABC was always very good to me, and I always like to go on the ABC. Contrary to people who are critics of the ABC, you actually have to show up. To be fair to the ABC will often invite people on and they will refuse to go. Okay, so the ABC will invite you, and very often people who are perhaps contrary the dominant ideas of the left of politics, they will not go on the ABC, and that is a great mistake. You never ever surrender ground. You never ever fail to argue your case. Even if you are muted and you're shouting into the void, you are still making your case. Okay? Never ever surrender that ground. It's a very, very big error that people make, I think, in public debate, is to surrender their ground. Okay, so I've been to the ABC and I've been around sort of people, say, who are not as enthusiastic about our monarchy. But I was always struck by the generational divide. There was a stark generational divide between very often younger people and those who I would loosely refer to as people who still live on the spirit of 75. And that's particularly in the media. I think that one of the reasons for this stark generational divide, and I think that among young people, there is a greater openness to valuing the stability and the inheritance of institutions like the Crown. I think it is because if you've looked back at the past quarter century, certainly since that referendum in 1999, I think we could say the monarchy has had a good quarter century. We were all blessed to live under the late Queen Elizabeth II, the only monarch I ever knew. And she provided such a great example of service and virtue and fortitude in difficult circumstances, and the most unfashionable of essential virtues, which is perseverance. Her Majesty just kept going. Compare that to the last 25 years of our elected governments. We have dysfunction, we have over-promising and under-delivering, we have failure to address very, very important issues. Anyone who's ever seen much of my writing would know my two sort of hobby horse issues are the failure to build housing and to ensure that young Australians have a stake in their own country, and the other is domestic nuclear energy. I've said repeatedly whenever I write on, for instance, housing, I always say this, and I just do not understand why people who are on the right of politics do not get this. There is no future for conservative politics if young Australians do not have something of their own to conserve. I've said this repeatedly for 10 years. Like water dropping on a stone, I'm still not sure it is penetrated through to Canberra. Perhaps another election defeat is needed for that to happen. But young Australians need to have some stake in their own country. Okay? And that's very important, again, because of that idea of rootedness, of being connected to your own country, that this is your country, that you will steward for a while, then you will hand on. Because ultimately, like the monarchy, family, like life, is about essentially being trustees. We're all here for a brief time, we steward what we inherit, We look after it, we protect it, and we hand it on for the good of future generations. That is the agreement. That is the compact we have among ourselves. We don't have it reduced to writing in any way like that, but that is the sort of national compact. Somehow in the last quarter century, that compact got torn up. We never voted on it, but that just was almost an agreement among our elites that that was a model that didn't work for Australia anymore. So I think insofar as our monarchy performs that dignified, continual role, and our elected officials provide a dysfunctional and sometimes ethically corrupt role, we have this sort of stark contrast. And it's kind of unsurprising that if you're younger and if you grow up amongst that, you're obviously going to find the more dignified element more attractive, if only on aesthetics. And so I think one of the issues that comes up again and again when people look at our society today, and you see this particularly in reporting that younger people, particularly younger men, are returning to more traditional forms of Christianity, for example. There is more going on in the society that we can see in terms of form and in terms of appearance. And we shouldn't be measuring these just by election results. Election results are voting snapshots in time, but societies live day to day. And if you think about it, coming back to that theme of roots, our monarchy, while the concept of monarchy is a universal form of governance, it's a form of governance you can find in many different cultures and civilizations. In our inheritance, it is a deeply biblical concept that comes back to the Jewish and the Christian roots of our civilization. Our monarchs are anointed. They take oaths, they make vows to protect and to guard and defend what has been entrusted to them. Our monarchs are, to use a naval term, which I unapologetically use, our monarchs are there to husband, to maintain and keep safe the constitutional order for the benefit of their people. Okay, it is not self-interested. It is literally a guardianship role. And so that perpetuity of earthly monarchy is to remind us in a way, if you are religious, of the divine perpetuity. That is that the monarchy and essentially monarchy and the churches in their own way are mutually reinforcing. And it's why, for instance, I would say any attempt to secularise and to quote unquote modernise the monarchy is foolish. It's foolish and it's fatally contradictory. Okay, you are dealing with an ancient institution with deep roots. You fail to tend to those roots at your own peril. And in this respect, and I don't just do this as a barrister and as a former constitutional law lecturer and examiner, I do this also as an Australian. I draw your attention to our own constitution and its preamble. In that preamble, the very beginning of our constitution, it states what? It states that we as Australians coming together, we humbly rely upon the blessings of Almighty God. That's the first part. And we unite as Australians under the Crown and under our Constitution, in that order. I used to say that to my students. Note that in the preamble. God is mentioned. As a Catholic, it's one of our great boasts. God is in the Constitution because Catholics would not vote for federation without it. Okay? We'd had a fairly rough previous 2 centuries. So, okay, dealing with like secular tyrants, we said, no, there's no constitution that does not explicitly mention God. Okay? So that was a win for us. But God is mentioned, the Crown is mentioned, the Constitution is mentioned. And what I always tell my students are the 2 unders. It's a federation under the Crown and under the Constitution in that order. Why does the Crown come first? Because the Crown is an ancient institution and it predates the Constitution. You can't understand the Constitution without understanding the Crown. The Crown comes into the Constitution. The Constitution does not create the Crown. The Crown is brought into the Constitution for a very, very specific purpose. And the point of that is to provide this enduring repository of executive power and the norms around it as a protective guardian of the constitutional order that the Constitution erects. And I mentioned in my address last year when I quoted the former Pope Leo XIII. He said in the 19th century, the best course in human affairs is to see human affairs as they are. You look at them exactly as they are, in their substance, not their form. And I repeat that, as we're now, at least I am, again in a Leonine papacy, I repeat that. We must always see human affairs as they are. We live in an age where our political processes seem to too many to be rigged, bought out and corrupted. Public trust in many institutions has been damaged, and it was not done overnight. So if you know this, and you know that the political game has very, very rough players who do not necessarily subscribe to ethics that broadly most in this room would share, you want to have not just referees but guardians of that political game. And that is particularly so if you ever want to play that game to achieve some form of reform, some form of needed change. And I think that is, again, one of those things that the Crown does in our Constitution, both looking backwards and looking forwards. It provides that refereeing, that guardian function that ensures that no matter how bad our politicians get, there is only so much damage they can do. And I think that is something to bear in mind. One of the blessings of our system is that so many important public officials, they give their allegiance, they pledge to serve the Crown, whether it's the police, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the armed forces, whether it's whole groups of important officials in society. They serve the Crown and not the government of the day. They might be responsive to the government of the day, but they do not serve them. That is something that is very, very important. I need not give this audience particularly a lecture in how many countries do not have that and the consequences for their history of not having that idea that there is something above and beyond the political process that the executive government exists to serve. Okay. And so what I would say is the constitutionally entrenched position of the monarchy, it takes away the chance or the opportunity or indeed the ambition of grasping politicians for more and more power. And I note all this, that we're now in the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam dismissal. I did not grow up with the Whitlam dismissal other than to keep hearing about it and hearing about it and hearing about it. And I reached not the end of my tether, but I reached a certain satisfaction earlier this year that come the 50th anniversary, I would have to write something about it, which I did in the Daily Telegraph very recently. And while I will not rehash what I say there, because I rehashed and resmashed it, I will just make a couple of points about the dismissal and why it matters. One point I will make, and I keep making, and I was very happy to see my former student Catherine Deeves make this morning, is that November 1975 was a perfectly orthodox operation of our constitutional order. Okay? The Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, as the late Queen's representative, took decisive action to remedy a political impasse that had led to a dismal state of affairs, particularly the prospect of the Commonwealth of Australia running out of appropriated money to conduct the ordinary affairs of the government. I would go so far as to say Sir John Kerr not only did his duty, he did only what he could do because it was his mission to do it. The protective, what I've referred to before, the protective or guardianship role of the Governor-General as the monarch's representative under our Constitution is explicitly set out in the Constitution. The Governor-General is armed with certain powers to protect the constitutional order. These are powers the Governor-General does not need the support or the advice of the government of the day to exercise. First of all, the Governor-General can at any time they want prorogue the Parliament as a whole and dissolve the House for fresh elections. Any Governor-General can do that. There's a reason why they are armed with those powers, not because they're going to be exercised very often, but because there may come a time when they need to be. And our forefathers were very, very smart in the way they drafted the Constitution. That is in Section 5. Also, every minister, however impressed they are with themselves, however large they think their mandate from the Australian people is, every minister serves at the pleasure of the Crown. They have no right to hold that office. That goes all the way to the Prime Minister, who, for the purposes of our Constitution, is just another minister. Prime Ministers have no right to hold that office. It is by convention that they are invited to form a government as the head. Prime, from the Latin primus, the first, as the first minister of the Crown. Until a crisis exists or their party room grow tired of them, Yes, they persist in office, but no one has a right to be Prime Minister. And again, the Governor-General in 1975 was the sentry of our most basic law, the Constitution. Okay? And he thus is armed by the Constitution appropriately for that mission. Do not ever surrender, again coming back to that point, never surrender the ground of November 1975. The Governor-General did what he was required to do. He was required to do what he did because under Section 61 of the Constitution, his duty is to execute and maintain the Constitution and the laws made under it. His job is not to implement some vague democratic will. His job is not to read the tea leaves. His job is not to be a cipher of his particular government of the day. And so in 1975, instead of some sort of corrupt Canberra deal resolving the crisis, Sir John Kerr, in my view, bravely ensured that the Australian people would be the ones who would decide how that crisis would be resolved. Because again, the Crown's role is what? To protect the constitutional order and to ensure in an almost trustee-like fashion that the rights of the people to govern themselves are protected. So the irony, I think, of this 50th anniversary debate over the Whitlam dismissal, which really just is tiresome, and hopefully we are going to dismiss the dismissal, is that we end up in this very bizarre situation where, to believe the press this year, when the Whitlam government was elected in 1972 and then in 1974, Australia was a functional democracy. But when the Whitlam parties were rejected in 1975 and 1977, we became some sort of fascist authoritarian state. Obviously, that's just ridiculous. Rather, it's a unwillingness to accept the umpire's decision, in this case, the Australian people's decision. And ultimately, one thing we look to the Governor-General to do is when an impasse or a problem arises, is to ensure that the people will resolve it at the ballot box peacefully, which is what has happened. And so, not just the November 1975 commemorations are just silly. We had the palace letters as well, which a friend of mine who's not particularly conservative always jokes, the palace letters are the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction of the Australian left. There was absolutely nothing in the palace letters that was new. There's no revelations there. The fact that Sir John Kerr had always said he did not inform the Queen of what he was doing during the entirety of the November 1975 crisis was borne out. There was no secret communique. There was nothing. And why is that? Because the Governor-General is the representative of the monarch, not their agent. The Governor-General is there to represent the monarch and to perform the tasks assigned to him or her under the Constitution, which again comes back to Section 61, that idea of executing and maintaining the Constitution, of protecting the constitutional order. One of the, I think, regretful parts of this year has been that, and I hesitate to criticise the current Governor-General, but it is not good for a serving Governor-General to give to the political class any indication of what they would not do. Okay? Threats to our constitutional order may come from various places, but they will come particularly from within the Constitution itself, from the Parliament in Chapter 1. Okay? Last thing you do is tell people tempted to bad behaviour what you may not be willing to do. Okay? It's very important that the Governor-General of the day, whoever they are, not be on overly familiar terms with any minister, any senator, any member of Parliament. There is a crucial difference between being a leader and being a cheerleader that everyone should bear in mind. There's nothing wrong with having a Governor-General who has political experience or indeed some deep partisan views. We've had many Governors-General and state governors who are ex-politicians who've had very strong views but nonetheless have performed the office impeccably. I think we had John Anderson here this morning. I think everyone could say hand on their heart, John is obviously a man of some sort of conservative views, but I think all of us would agree that if John Anderson was the Governor-General, he would perform the office impeccably straight, in an impeccable and straight manner. I don't think anyone on any shade of politics would ever think John Anderson, for instance, would ever, despite having had a very distinguished career in partisan politics, I don't think anyone would ever think he would ever exercise that office in any form of partisan way. I think he would go out of his way not to. I think it's very, very important the Governor-General today always be a bit removed from the politics of the day and be very careful to ever seem to be part of one side, even if they have been in some historic way. All of us have strong views on different things, I'm a barrister. I have strong views on a number of subjects. Nonetheless, I represent many sorts of people who otherwise I might disagree with. But one of the important things is that I go into court and I give them the best representation I can, because everyone deserves to have their case put as strongly as possible. And our system works best when everyone is fiercely advocating for that position, for their position. Okay, it works worst when we're all just partisan hacks. And I think that is just something that's an important part of our system. So in talking about where we have been, where we have gone, I'll just close out the conference by relating a favourite story of mine about just the value of monarchy. And in this history, when I tell it, you'll understand why it was valuable and why it was so destructive when it was missed. And that's the story of the quite famous visit in April 1910 of the former US President Theodore Roosevelt when he went to visit the penultimate Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph. Theodore Roosevelt was obviously a New Yorker, very large personality, very strong opinions, often compared to a monarch or a dictator himself. There may be some modern day parallels, who knows. But Theodore Roosevelt, it was said, he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He was a man who I think today we would diagnose with ADHD, particularly the attention part. But he was a great US president. I think he was one of the greatest US presidents. And Roosevelt wanted to meet Franz Joseph, who was the emperor, the Austro-Hungarian emperor. He'd been reigning since 1848. So Roosevelt wanted to meet him. And so he went to Vienna and he met the emperor in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. And they had a long discussion about ancient and new regimes. One thing that was very interesting about the American Republic and American republicanism, particularly if you read the Federalist Papers, they were not rubes. They were not fools. Whatever views you might have about 1776, and I have family that was all on the Tory side, nonetheless, the American founding fathers were very, very smart men who were very, very well aware of different systems of government. They were quite worldly men of their time, very well read, deeply steeped in the classics, and produced the one republic that seems to have worked if you can just put the Civil War to one side. But Roosevelt was very interested in Franz Joseph, and so they had this long discussion about ancient new regimes, monarchies and the like. And finally, towards the end, Roosevelt, the story goes, asked the emperor, he said, look, he said in a very polite way, what exactly is it that you do all day as emperor? He said, I was the president of the United States, I sat atop a federal system, but what exactly is it that you do all day? And the story goes, the Kaiser went into deep thought for a moment. And he turned to Roosevelt and said, I think through a translator, he said, you see in me the last monarch of the old school. As emperor, it is my duty to protect my people from their politicians. And you see in that clearly, whether you're talking, to go back to this morning, about a Roman law or a common law heritage, whether you're talking about a monarchy in the continent or the British monarchy that we inherit, you're talking about that idea that there is a sovereign who has a deep responsibility entrusted to them to protect a constitutional order for the good of their people. And for well over a century, we've talked here about migration and patterns of migration. Both my late parents were migrants. People from all over the world have flocked to this country, in part, I think in large part, because of our institutions, because of the life that our institutions create for them and the possibilities they create for them. I served in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Persian Gulf, East Timor, and a few other places. I was a naval intelligence officer in the Navy. I still serve as a reservist. One of the great things on Anzac Day is you have the march through the city. And then if you're ever at a loose end, after you visited the shrine, which is wonderful now, go to Museum Station every year. There is a group of state transit volunteers. They man this long table, and it's got tea, coffee, biscuits, and the like. And they're there basically to help older veterans who have mobility issues or are a little bit lost to find their way home. I'll just put it this way. Not one person who was one of those many volunteers working at that platform from dawn till late on Anzac Day, not one of them, I'm willing to bet, had an ancestor on the First Fleet. But they love Australia. They love what this country has done for them. They love the opportunities that this country has done for them. And they love the institutions of Australia, such that they really get into Anzac Day. It's their day too, because this is their country too, and because they feel that their institutions have value. One of the worst things I think in our society is the people who've been born here, who've grown up here, do not have any of the appreciation for the great institutions that those who did not have that blessing of being born here and growing up here have. That this is a great country, that we have great institutions, that we have great stability. And on the 1st of January 1901, we as Australians united together under the Crown and under our Constitution. We have been blessed ever since with an inheritance that endures to this day. An inheritance that we must all steward and we must all protect from all those who would do it harm. Well may we say, God save the King. But even more so today, we should say in the word of St. Peter's letter, honour all people, love their brotherhood, fear God, and honour the King. So thank you very much for allowing me to close out this conference.